Inside a cramped suburban living room, a man stands in front of a television, rocking back and forth with his hands clamped to the top of his head. It is August 13th. Christopher Watts is watching footage from his neighbor's Vivint security camera. The screen shows his white Anadarko work truck backed directly up to his garage door at 5:15 in the morning. He tells the police officer standing next to him that he was just loading work tools and a lunchbox. He is talking fast, filling the silence, attempting to explain away every pixel. Police know his pregnant wife Shanann and 2 young daughters are missing. They also know Shanann's car is parked in her garage. Her Lupus medication is sitting inside her purse, and the interior front door latch was secured from the inside. Therefore, someone would have had to leave through that garage. The neighbor's camera recorded 27 uninterrupted minutes. But the footage never captures a woman or 2 little girls walking away. It only captures a man loading heavy bundles, and a nervous suspect watching himself do it, completely unaware of the behavioral leak that just destroyed his alibi. The man pacing the floor is Christopher Lee Watts. The house next door, located at 2825 Saratoga Trail, is a 5-bedroom suburban property. To the outside world, the Watts family functioned seamlessly. Shanann Watts broadcasted a successful life to her social media followers, selling health supplements from home for a company called Lavelle. Chris worked as an operator for Anadarko Petroleum. But the financial reality told a different story. The couple filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy in 2015, drowning in nearly $450,000 of debt. Therefore, the tension inside the house had been building long before Shanann flew to Arizona for a weekend business trip in August 2018.
While she was away, Chris stayed in Colorado with their 4-year-old daughter Bella and 3-year-old Celeste.
Shanann was 15 weeks pregnant with a boy they planned to name Nico. She arrived home at 1:48 in the morning on August 13th. Her friend and colleague, Nicole Atkinson, dropped her off. Security footage captured Shanann walking up the steps to her front door. That was the last time anyone saw her alive. A few hours later, Shanann missed a scheduled prenatal appointment. She did not answer any text messages. Therefore, Atkinson grew concerned and drove back to the Frederick house just after noon. She knocked. No one answered. She noticed Shanann's car parked in the garage. When she tried to open the front door, she found the interior latch engaged, preventing it from opening more than 3 inches. Someone had locked it from the inside. Atkinson called Chris at his work site. She also called the Frederick Police Department. By 1:40 that afternoon, an officer was standing in the driveway, waiting for Chris to return and open the house. When Chris let them in, the physical evidence immediately contradicted the idea of a voluntary departure. Shanann's purse sat on the kitchen island. Inside were her car keys and her phone. More importantly, her medication for lupus was still there. Atkinson told the officer Shanann would never leave that medicine behind. Upstairs, investigators found her wedding ring resting on the nightstand. The children's car seats were still strapped into the vehicle in the garage. If she left voluntarily, how did she travel? If she took the girls, why leave the car seats? Chris claimed they had an emotional conversation about a trial separation around 4 in the morning. He said it was not argumentative.
He told police he left for work at 5:15, and Shanann told him she was taking the girls to a friend's house later that day.
But the neighbor's Vivint camera captured no such departure. It only showed Chris. The Frederick police officers were now looking at a husband who claimed his family walked out the door, and a camera that proved they never did. Chris gave television interviews to local Denver stations outside his house, pleading for his wife and daughters to come back. He stared into the camera and said he wanted his family safe. While he spoke, police search dogs could be heard barking in the background, working the perimeter of his property. Investigators needed to look closer at Chris's movements in the days before the disappearance. They requested his phone records. The data extraction exposed a hidden fracture in the marriage. Chris Watts was having an affair with a coworker named Nicole Kessinger. He told Kessinger he was separated and going through a divorce. During their relationship, Chris maintained strict operational security. He always paid for their dates using preloaded gift cards, ensuring Shanann could not track his spending through their bank statements. But that pattern shifted abruptly. On August 11th, less than 36 hours before Shanann disappeared, Chris took Kessinger to dinner. This time, he used his personal credit card. Kessinger later told police it was as if he had nothing to hide or nothing to lose. The sudden abandonment of his financial cover raises a critical question. Did Chris Watts decide on that Saturday night that he no longer needed to hide his tracks from his wife? The surveillance footage court the lie, but investigators still had to find the bodies. On August 15th, 2 days after the disappearances, the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Colorado Bureau of Investigation brought Chris in for an interview. CBI agent Tammy Lee administered a polygraph test.
Before the test began, Chris sat in the interview room and talked calmly about a disconnect in his marriage.
He mentioned a 5-week period over the summer when Shanann took the girls to North Carolina to visit family. Chris said their conversations grew shorter. The text messages lacked affection. Agent Lee listened, observing his baseline behavior. She noticed a specific, vital linguistic shift. When Chris talked about his missing daughters, he referred to them in the past tense. In behavioral analysis, this points toward cognitive closure. He already knew they were not coming back. The polygraph test focused on 3 direct questions. Did he know where Shanann was? Did he physically cause her disappearance? Was he lying about the last time he saw her? Chris maintained his nervous, cooperative persona, but his physiological responses spiked. In standard polygraph scoring, a -4 indicates deception. Chris scored a -18. He failed miserably. Agent Lee and FBI Special Agent Graham Coder confronted him with the chart. Lee told him that his body was reacting to the lie, making him physically sick. Coder pushed harder. He told Chris they knew about the affair with Nicole Kessinger. They had the text messages. They had the GPS data from his Anadarko work truck. They even had the data from the family's Amazon Alexa device. Coder pointed out that Chris had lied to everyone, including his own father, Ronnie Watts, who had flown from North Carolina to support him. The interrogation room clock ticked in the background. Chris crossed his arms. He asked to speak to his father. The agents left the room, allowing Ronnie Watts to sit at the table with his son. Before Chris confessed to his father, the agents had employed a highly specific psychological wedge. They offered him a scenario that minimized his culpability.
Agent Lee suggested that perhaps Shanann did something to the girls, and Chris simply reacted to protect them or clean up the mess.
This is a standard interrogation tactic designed to give a suspect a face-saving way to admit to a homicide. Chris took the bait exactly as the agents anticipated. He leaned in close to his father, keeping his voice barely above a whisper. He told a new story. He admitted to killing Shanann, but he framed it as an act of reactive rage. He claimed he went downstairs after their conversation about separating. When he came back upstairs, he said he checked the baby monitor on the nightstand. According to this new version of events, the monitor showed Shanann actively strangling 3-year-old Celeste. He told his father that 4-year-old Bella was already sprawled out on her bed, blue. Chris claimed he panicked, rushed into the room, and strangled his wife to stop her. Ronnie Watts listened in stunned silence, rubbing his face with his hand. He asked his son if he hauled the bodies away. Chris replied that he did not know what else to do. Ronnie asked, "So she killed both CC and Bella, choked them to death, and you lost it and choked her?"
Chris replied,
"MMHM. That's just. It's rage."
His father turned his head away and said,
"God Almighty, son." When agents Lee and Coder stepped back into the room, they did not immediately challenge the baby monitor story. Their primary objective was recovering the victims. They pressed Chris for the location. He confessed to loading his dead wife and 2 dead daughters into the back of his work truck. He gave the police the exact coordinates of where he took them. The location was Survey 319, an Anadarko Petroleum oil field roughly 40 miles east of the family's home. Chris provided an aerial map and marked 3 separate spots. He told investigators he buried Shanann in a shallow grave.
He then admitted to dropping his 2 little girls inside the massive crude oil storage tanks on the property.
Investigators now had a confession and a location. He claimed he acted in a blind panic, disposing of the bodies before his co-workers arrived. But a closer examination of his actions that morning revealed a deeply unsettling calm. After burying his wife and submerging his daughters in crude oil, Chris Watts worked a normal shift. His colleagues later reported to police that he behaved like it was a completely average Monday. Furthermore, records showed he called the girls' school that same day to disenroll them, stating they would not be returning. He also contacted a real estate agent to discuss selling the house on Saratoga Trail. These administrative tasks, completed mere hours after he wiped out his entire family, stood in stark contrast to his claim of temporary insanity. If a man kills his wife in a sudden fit of protective rage, does he logically cancel his children's preschool enrollment by lunchtime? The Frederick Police, the CBI, and the FBI mobilized a recovery team to secure the Survey 319 oil site. Because the children were reportedly inside active crude oil storage tanks, the operation required specialized hazardous materials crews. The environment at Survey 319 was toxic and volatile. The hazmat teams arrived late at night on August 15th. The glow of floodlights illuminated the dirt roads and the towering metal tanks. Using the map Chris provided, investigators easily located the freshly disturbed earth where he buried Shanann. Next to the grave, they found a broken rake. Chris later admitted he tried to smooth the dirt over the burial site, but the handle snapped, so he threw it in the brush. A drone search of the surrounding field turned up a bedsheet that matched the pattern of pillowcases found stuffed in a kitchen trash can back at the Watts home.
The physical ledger of the crime was writing itself in the dirt of Weld County.
But the most grueling task remained. The hazmat crew had to drain the crude oil from the 400-barrel storage tanks to recover Bella and Celeste. The process would take hours, stretching into the afternoon of August 16th. What the medical examiner found during the recovery would obliterate Chris Watts's baby monitor alibi forever. The medical examiner's report formally dismantled the narrative Chris Watts had sold to his father in the interrogation room. The autopsies confirmed Shanann died of manual strangulation. But 3-year-old Celeste and 4-year-old Bella were smothered. Furthermore, the physical condition of Bella's body told a story of active, desperate resistance. She had bitten through her own tongue multiple times while fighting for air against her attacker. The recovery site at Servi 319 provided its own horrific forensic ledger. The hatch openings at the top of the massive Anadarko crude oil tanks measured exactly 8 inches in diameter. The medical examiner documented sharp scratches and abrasions on Bella's left buttock, proving she was forcefully wedged through the narrow steel opening. A tuft of blonde hair remained stuck to the rusted edge of the hatch. Therefore, Shanann could not have killed the girls in their beds. Dead bodies do not fight back, and a woman who was actively being strangled by her husband could not have transported her daughters 40 miles into the eastern plains. Chris had lied, and he would maintain that lie until the threat of a trial forced his hand. In November of 2018, Chris pleaded guilty to all charges to avoid the death penalty, a concession explicitly requested by Shanann's grieving family. He was sentenced to 5 life terms without the possibility of parole.
Shortly after his sentencing, he was transferred out of Colorado to the Dodge Correctional Institution in Waupun, Wisconsin, due to severe security concerns.
He was locked away, but the investigative file remained incomplete. The physical evidence proved he killed them, but the precise chronology of that morning was still trapped in his head. The complete truth of what happened inside the house on Saratoga Trail remained hidden until February of the following year. Investigators from the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, and the Frederick Police Department traveled to the Wisconsin prison to interview him. Stripped of his freedom and his fabricated public image, Chris finally abandoned the baby monitor alibi. He admitted the murders were not a spontaneous reaction to his wife's violence, but a calculated execution of his own design. The true sequence of events began shortly after Shanann returned from her Arizona business trip at 1:48 in the morning. According to his prison confession, Chris woke her up to discuss their failing marriage. He told her he no longer loved her and wanted a formal separation. He claimed she responded by crying and threatening to take the children away, stating,
"You're never gonna see the kids again."
That sentence, he claimed, was the absolute trigger. He straddled her in the bed and strangled her. He noted to investigators that she never screamed. She never fought back. He believed she might have been praying as she died. He wrapped her face down in a fitted bedsheet. Then, the physiological reality of death betrayed his quiet crime. As Shanann was strangled, her bowels evacuated. The noise of the physical struggle, combined with the sudden shift in the house's atmosphere, woke 4-year-old Bella. Bella walked into the master bedroom holding her blanket. She looked at the bed, saw her mother wrapped in the sheets, and asked,
"What's wrong with Mommy?"
Chris replied.
Mommy don't feel good.
He began dragging his wife's body down the wooden stairs. Bella watched him do it, crying, asking again what was wrong. Chris backed his white Anadarko work truck up to the garage, exactly as the neighbor's Vivint camera had recorded. He loaded Shanann's body into the bed of the truck. The surveillance camera never captured the girls leaving the house because they were alive and small enough to climb directly into the cab without being seen over the tailgate. Celeste cuddled a stuffed dog. The girls dozed on and off during the 40-mile drive to the oil field. They held each other in their sleep, resting in each other's laps. At one point, the smell of Shanann's voided bowels reached the cab of the truck. Beller woke up and said,
"Daddy, it smells."
When they arrived at the desolate dirt road surrounded by towering metal tanks, Chris pulled Shanann's body from the truck bed. He dragged her to a patch of dirt and began digging a shallow grave with a shovel. Both of his daughters watched him through the truck windows. They asked what he was doing to their mother. Chris later told investigators he could not remember how he answered them, only that he continued to dig. He returned to the truck. He picked up Celeste's blue New York Yankees blanket and draped it over her head. He placed his hand over her mouth and nose, and his other hand around her neck. Beller sat right beside her sister, watching him smother her. Chris carried Celeste's lifeless body up the steep metal stairs of the battery, opened the heavy 8-inch hatch, and dropped her in feet first. When he returned to the truck, Beller asked,
"Is the same thing gonna happen to me as Cece?"
He did not answer. He simply moved toward her with the same blanket. Beller's final words were,
"Daddy, no."
She fought hard, grunting and twisting her head under the fabric. After she was dead, he carried her to the second tank and forced her through the opening. He finished burying his wife, but the wooden handle of his rake snapped as he tried to smooth the dirt over her grave. He threw the broken piece into the brush. After burying his family, Chris initiated a cover-up designed to simulate a normal Monday. At 5:27 in the morning, his truck GPS recorded him leaving the site. By mid-morning, he was actively manufacturing a paper trail. He sent text messages to Shanann's phone, asking her how the girls were doing, fully aware the device was wedged between the cushions of his own living room sofa. He responded to casual work emails. When Nicole Atkinson began calling him in a panic because Shanann had missed her prenatal appointment, Chris attempted to deflect her concern. He explicitly told her not to involve the police. He told Atkinson that Shanann had taken the girls to a playdate, a narrative that instantly fell apart when Atkinson realized the children's car seats were still securely strapped inside the vehicle in the garage. When the police eventually arrived, Chris stood in his neighbor Nate Trinastich's living room, watching the Vivint security footage. Trinastich noticed immediately that Chris was not acting like a word father. Chris was swaying, putting his hands on his head, and over-explaining every tiny movement on the screen. He babbled about loading lunchboxes and tools. As soon as Chris walked out the front door, Trinastich leaned over to the police officer and whispered, "He's not acting right at all." Trinastich also shattered the illusion of the perfect marriage, informing the officer that he had heard Chris and Shanann screaming at each other at the top of their lungs in the past. This neighborhood intercept was the crucial pivot point.
It transformed a routine welfare check into a targeted homicide investigation before the sun even set.
The psychological toll of this recovery operation fractured the investigators who worked it. Dave Baumhover, a Frederick police detective, later went on extended medical leave after developing severe post-traumatic stress disorder. The triggers were entirely innocuous. During a vacation to Phoenix, he watched two little girls walk into a restaurant, and his mind instantly snapped back to the smell of crude oil and the yellow hazmat suits. He described the trauma of the case as being trapped on the wrong carnival ride, completely unable to shut the machine off or step away. The physical ledger of the crime was simply too heavy for the department to process without collateral damage. Chris Watts believed he had committed the perfect crime. He believed the crude oil would dissolve the evidence, and the vast expanse of the Survey 319 site would hide his family forever. But the digital forensics would prove this was never a spontaneous domestic tragedy. To understand why a man with no criminal record eradicates his entire family before dawn, investigators had to look beyond the oil tanks. They had to look at his phone. When Nicole Kessinger walked into a police station on August 15th, she presented herself as a victim. She told investigators she believed Chris Watts was navigating an amicable divorce. She claimed ignorance. But digital forensics do not rely on self-reporting. Investigators extracted the data from her personal mobile device, exposing profound behavioral anomalies. Her deleted search history stretched back to August 2017. That was months before she claimed to have met Watts at Anadarko Petroleum. By January 2018, she was actively typing Shanann Watts and Chris Watts into Google. The digital dragnet pulled up hours of searches Kessinger conducted in the weeks leading up to the murders. She browsed online for wedding dresses.
She typed a highly specific query into a search engine, asking, "Will a man leave his wife and kids for his mistress?"
She was actively planning a future with a married man. But another extracted search query elevated the investigation from a domestic tragedy to a calculated execution. Kessinger had searched for medical instructions on how to induce a miscarriage. Why would a mistress care about inducing a miscarriage? The answer arrived much later, in letters Chris Watts sent to a pen pal from his maximum security prison cell. Stripped of his public facade, Watts provided the missing link. He confessed that he had been planning the annihilation of his family for weeks. He admitted he secretly slipped the opioid OxyContin into Shanann's medication before the murders. He believed that terminating the pregnancy of his unborn son, Nico, would untangle his familial obligations. A miscarriage would make it easier to dissolve his marriage and walk away. When the narcotics failed to kill the fetus, he resorted to his hands. But the motive was not purely romantic. It was an accounting decision. If a man wants a divorce, he typically files paperwork. But Christopher Watts was trapped in a catastrophic financial collapse. The couple's Chapter 7 bankruptcy filing in 2015 listed nearly $450,000 in liabilities. They were drowning in debt, attempting to sustain a $400,000 five-bedroom house on Saratoga Trail with a combined income of roughly $100,000. A divorce would mean alimony, child support for 3 children, and total financial ruin. Therefore, annihilating his family offered a perverse, absolute clean slate. The Weld County District Attorney's Office compiled an insurmountable mountain of evidence. They had the GPS coordinates from his work truck. They had the text messages outlining a fractured marriage. They had the neighbor's surveillance footage. On November 6, 2018, faced with the absolute certainty of a trial, Christopher Watts entered a surprise guilty plea to 9 separate felony counts.
He admitted to 5 counts of first-degree murder.
The state charged him twice for the deaths of Bella and Celeste because they were children under the age of 12 killed by a person in a position of trust. He also pleaded guilty to the unlawful termination of a pregnancy and 3 counts of tampering with a deceased human body. The prosecution possessed a pristine capital murder case. But the district attorney did not pursue the death penalty. Frank and Sandra Rusek, Shanann's grieving parents, made the explicit request. They stated they did not want to see another life taken. They simply wanted the legal process to end. On November 19th, Watts sat in a Greeley, Colorado courtroom. He wore an orange jumpsuit and shackles. Judge Marcelo Kopkow looked down from the bench and described the killings as perhaps the most inhumane and vicious crime he had ever handled. Watts received 5 life sentences without the possibility of parole. 3 of those life sentences were ordered to run consecutively. He received an additional 84 years for terminating the pregnancy and hiding the bodies in the crude oil. The physical case was closed. But the collateral damage continued to spread. Shortly after sentencing, Watts was transferred out of Colorado. He arrived at the Dodge Correctional Institution in Waupun, Wisconsin, due to severe security concerns regarding his safety in the general prison population. He took photographs of his wife and daughters with him. He told investigators he reads his daughters' favorite books to their pictures every night in his cell. Petitions circulated online demanding the prison confiscate the photos of his victims, but Wisconsin officials stated the pictures did not violate departmental policy. While Watts sat in a concrete cell, Shanann's family faced a different kind of confinement. Nearly a year after the murders, Frank Rusek stood outside the empty house in Frederick.
He begged the public to leave his family alone.
Online trolls and conspiracy theorists had subjected the grieving grandparents to vicious bullying and slander. Strangers capitalized on false rumors, forcing the family to relive the trauma daily. Frank likened the abuse to the harassment faced by the families of the Sandy Hook school shooting. The Ruseks had filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Watts, winning a $6 million civil judgment they would likely never collect. They just wanted to mourn in peace. Meanwhile, the house at 2825 Saratoga Trail sat vacant. It fell into foreclosure, scheduled for public auction. It remained a massive wooden monument to a fabricated life. Christopher Watts believed he could engineer the perfect disappearance. He assumed the desolate expanse of Survey 319 would swallow his wife and daughters forever. He calculated that the highly toxic crude oil would dissolve the biological evidence before anyone thought to drain the massive 400-barrel tanks. He thought he could use his quiet, introverted demeanor to manipulate experienced investigators into believing his wife was a monster. But he fundamentally misunderstood the modern digital dragnet. He left a trail of gift cards, text messages, deleted web searches, and precise truck telematics. He forgot that every movement leaves a digital shadow. Most importantly, he forgot about Nate Trinastich's Vivint camera mounted next door. He backed his white Anadarko truck up to his garage to hide his crimes in the shadows. He thought the early morning darkness would conceal the transfer of 3 bodies. But the camera recorded the exact duration of his cover-up. It recorded a man systematically erasing his family. He backed in. She never left.
And a 27-minute video clip ensured he would never walk free again.
If you want the next real case drawn the same way, subscribe to Criminally Drawn. I'm John T. Thank you for watching.